We're hearing the Sermon on the Mount. Wow. This happens in chapter 5 of Matthew's Gospel. It's very early on, which means that many of the people who are listening to this sermon are still trying to decide if they should follow Jesus or not. Many have been listening to him and they're attracted to him, but ultimately they're still waiting to make that decision. Is this the man I want to leave it all to follow? And so he's giving an extended sermon. The Sermon on the Mount goes for 2 full chapters where people are just going to be listening to the whole project. Jesus is going to lay out all of what it means to be his follower, what it will mean to be a Christian. And we're at the beginning of that sermon. And he uses 2 very important symbols, salt of the earth and light of the world, that would speak very loudly to that group, but to you and I sometimes might seem a bit baffling, because Jesus is using metaphors and examples that were very fitting for his time. Not that we can't use them, but let's break it open a little bit to hear what maybe those early followers of Jesus might have heard when Jesus said those, and see if that can help us. Okay? The Sermon on the Mount is taking place up on a hill, and right below them is the Sea of Galilee. Jesus says to them, "You are the salt of the earth." And for those listening, that would have resonated in a powerful way. The Sea of Galilee was the great fishing hub of Israel. Wasn't Peter a fisherman? Yeah. It was a big fishing economy. And on the east end of that lake, they had a processing plant where they processed those fish. And they would preserve them with refrigerators. They would bring salt over from the Dead Sea that was just east of that place with an endless supply of salt. And all those fish would be processed and salted, in other words, preserved. And Josephus, who was an ancient historian, said that the salted fish of Galilee made its way to the markets of the city of Rome. So salt was an important part. They would have understood, because in the ancient world, salt was how you preserved food, wasn't it? So let's hear what Jesus is saying. You are the salt of the earth. You who are listening to me, I could picture Jesus saying, you are going to be the agents of the preservation of life. You are to be the ones that go into this world, and through your presence and your action, this world will have life, literally, through you. It is because of you, your primary mission will be things like, literally, feeding the hungry. But not only that there is meant to be a life that is beyond just the physical, that you as disciples are meant to express and transfer into the world through a divine power. You are to be a life-giving source that will preserve life in a powerful way for centuries to come. You're the salt of the earth. You will be the very instrument that keeps life happening, life alive, which is why the church is such an agent for life, isn't it? Because to keep life in all of that, what it means is at the core of what Jesus wanted us to do. We're meant to be the preservers of life on every level, both physically and spiritually and intellectually. When you think about what the church has done since the very beginning, the church was the first group that mass-produced care for the poor in an organized manner, haven't we? The church was the first group that organized health care and provided hospitals. Did you know that? Did you know that Christians invented hospitals? Did you know that? That's our heritage. The word hospital comes from what word? Hospitality, which is part and parcel to the Christian mission, to provide hospitality. It's written right in the law of Israel. Christians from the earliest days, too, founded things called schools The Catholic Church invented the university system to be the salt of the earth, to preserve life at every level. Jesus' command and his mission to his disciples: make this world stay alive. Not only physically, but always spiritually as well. What a mission, huh? And they understood that in a powerful way. Now we can also look at salt from a different perspective. He talks about the flavor of salt. Any of you cook? I'm good at eating the food. What's food without salt, really? What's a baked potato like without salt? Really? Eggs without salt? What does salt do? Salt is an incredible seasoning. If used correctly, salt actually causes the flavors of the food to come out stronger. Isn't that amazing? Salt actually makes what's there be magnified. Isn't that strange? So salt actually makes the food taste better. It's like it magnifies the flavors that are there. You're the salt of the earth. You're meant to go out into this world, and that the gifts and talents that people have, your relationship with them should be one that calls their gifts and talents forward. That you should be an instrument in the world to magnify the gifts that God has given to the world. That we are to be the group that goes out there and just causes life to spring forth. Now, we all have had too much salt in our food, haven't we? So we have to be careful, because too much salt is bad. Christ does not want his disciples to go out there and dominate the world, overpower the world. And we've learned in our history, sometimes the hard way, of finding that balance, huh? He wants us to be those people who can come into a room and make the room better by our presence. Are you that kind of a person? Think about people who you know. If you go to, let's say you go to a social event or even to a meeting, and when that person walks through the door, you're like, oh yes. You're just happy that person's there because there's going to be a positive energy. You just know there's going to be hard work and support. You just know that there's going to be goodness there. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? And then you know the opposite, right? That when that other person walks through the door, you're like, it's going to be a long meeting. Which one are you? This is where, as we approach Lent here soon, is to examine that, is that oftentimes we don't see ourselves as we really are, which is why the sacrament of reconciliation and a regular examination of conscience can help shed light on our true identities, because we all think we're the good salt, don't we? We all think we're the good salt, and many of you are. You're the salt of the earth. Are you a dominator? Do you come into the room and control it? Or do you bring out what is meant to be there? What a great example, isn't that? So those who are listening to them, this is what they're being to Jesus, this is what they're being invited into. To be one that's going to bring out an incredible activeness and activity of life in the world. And then finally, you are the light of the world. To those who were hearing Jesus, they were living in a very different time than you and me. They were living without electricity. Just ponder that for a second, of not having electrical lights and how different our life would be. Light was something precious to them. Just below the hills, that hill where Jesus was giving the Sermon on the Mount, were giant olive orchards. And those olive orchards would be picked, and those olives would be pressed for their olive oil. And that oil would be used for their lamps. That's how they lit their lamps, and their house was with olive oil. Did you know that? They had little lamps, and that's how they would light their house. So if you wanted light in your house, it took a tremendous amount of effort and money to have that oil in that lamp. It took the growing of the trees, the pressing of the olives, the processing of the oil. And so light was valuable, precious, and expensive. And nobody wasted light in those days. They didn't just leave the lights on all night. They didn't leave their lamps burning all night. They understood that to get that oil took tremendous sacrifice, hard work, and effort. And so when Jesus says, "You are the light of the world," those people would have understood light is something precious that requires great sacrifice and hard work. I'm calling upon you, disciples, that what you're going to be about is bringing about light in the world. And in order for that light to happen, it's going to require a tremendous amount of sacrifice and hard work on your part. You're going to have to commit yourself completely to this task, because to be the light of the world is not simply flipping on a light switch. That is why you would never light a lamp and put it under a bushel basket. What a waste would that be? But we who have electricity, we've kind of lost that, haven't we? But not them. You are a precious commodity. And what your life is going to be based upon is sacrifice. The squeezing of the olive, which produces that precious oil, which gives that precious light and allows for cooking. He is giving a precursor for the cross. Jesus is the one whose life, the life that he will give us in grace, will come through the crushing of the grape, so to speak, the crushing of the olive of his life. And we will all be invited into a life of profound sacrifice and service. But when we do that in Jesus' name, it brings light to the world. It brings that precious gift of light. And I want to end with this, and it's the great prophecy from Isaiah. And perhaps you missed it when you heard it this morning. Isaiah is foreseeing Jesus in the future, and he knows what the Messiah is going to call us to. And so he says, this is what the reading said today. "Thus says the Lord, share your bread with the hungry. Shelter the oppressed and the homeless. Clothe the naked when you see them, and don't turn your back on your own." That's what being the salt of the earth and light of the world means, doesn't it? And then he says this, Isaiah, before the Lord, with that clarity of vision that comes from those great mystics who were so close to God. Then he says this, "Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your wound shall quickly be healed." Read that again. "Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your wound will quickly be healed." You're the light of the world. When you let that light shine, meaning those who seek to save their lives will lose it, and those who will lose their lives for my sake will save it. If you will let your olives present your life be crushed and sacrifice for others, if you dedicate your lives for others, if you are an instrument of preserving life and bringing out life in others, which means I have to constantly lower myself because the focus of my life is not me, it's going to be those around me. I'm going to be the salt for them. I'm going to feed, I'm going to preserve life. And so if I live that way, my wound will be healed. It is in the act of this loving, generous service of God, when we deny ourselves and live for others, that God's healing grace flows through us and our wounds begin to become healed. Our brokenness, our bad habits, our tendencies to sin. Has there been something you've been struggling with for a long time in your life and you just can't seem to shake? Is there a particular tendency to sin or an attitude or something that just keeps plaguing you and you bring it to the confession over and over and over and you just, why can't I get over this? Maybe this gospel's for you. Maybe it's time for you to take your eyes off your wound and put your eyes on the wounds of others. And in the process of going towards them, God will heal you. But if you focus on just you, it's the opposite of Christianity. Christianity is a life and religion of love. And love is about doing the greatest good for the other. As Jesus said at the end, My commandment is to love one another. And no one has greater love than to lay down one's life for a friend.